I've made a lot of speculation videos on Arlecchino, and honestly, the last one I made held up pretty well, all things considered. Her themes around death and rebirth, her connections to the Crimson Moon Dynasty of Khaenri'ah, and her connection to the Book of Perinheri were all things I talked about, and they still work. Barring a few details here and there, of course. So you might be wondering, why am I making yet another Arlecchino video if the previous ones are still valid? Well, after playing through her story quest, reading her character stories, the lore of her weapon, and a few other things that are littered throughout the patch, I had an idea as to what exactly Arlecchino is. Arlecchino is an angel, and a vampire, and a penguin. Listen, I promise this all makes sense. All the evidence is there. I've just got to present it in a way that anyone can understand. And hopefully by going through the process of figuring out what Arlecchino is, we're also going to formulate a hypothesis about what happened to the Moon Sisters, including the Crimson Moon, and how all of that relates to the origins of Khaenri'ah. I have to apologize in advance though, because this video is probably going to feel very red string on a corkboard until about halfway through, so just sorry about that. Anyway, let's get to it, shall we? Timestamps, spoiler warning, citations, attributions, and links for more information or related theories will be down in the description box, while post-video notes and corrections will be added to a pinned comment. Peruse them at your leisure, but in the meantime, I would like to start things off with a little history lesson that will set the stage for exactly why Arlecchino is an angel vampire penguin. Wow, that sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud. Right, so, ancient history. In the beginning, Teyvat was ruled by the elemental dragons and their king, Nibelung. Everything was great until the primordial one arrived from beyond the sky and subjugated the dragons with the help of their four shades, establishing a new kingdom of Celestia in the process. Now, the goal of Celestia was to populate Teyvat with humans, so a barrier in the shape of a false sky was erected, and with the help of the Shade of Life, the primordial one created humans. Now, these humans were part of the original unified civilization who were to receive knowledge from their Seelie teachers. Now, Seelies are effectively angels as far as Genshin is concerned, and these Seelies reported to the three Moon Sisters, Aria, Sonnet, and Canon. Now, because the Seelies reported to the Moon Sisters and they were in charge of teaching the humans that the Primordial One created, many people speculate that three of the Primordial One's four shades were the three Moon Sisters. This would have made the Moon Sisters kind of like archangels. And after a period of relative peace of the unified civilization, invaders came from beyond the firmament and they broke through the false sky and set the world ablaze with war once again, and most of the unified civilization was lost in the process. But Celestia succeeded in driving back the invaders and established a new civilization under the rule of the 7 Archons, and that's where we're at now. Now, obviously, this is an abbreviated history, but you might notice that there is no mention of the moons falling or the Seelies vanishing, even though there should have been a period of time when Teyvat had 3 moons ruled by 3 Moon Sisters. And even though we do have legends that talk about their fall, it's always in the form of a self-contained legend that has no obvious connection to Teyvat's so-called Genesis story. And that's not too surprising, though, because Teyvat's Genesis myth leaves a lot of questions unanswered. For example, there's no mention of why the Primordial One came to Teyvat in the first place, or why they wanted to make humans specifically, nor is there any mention of who the invaders were or why the Primordial One wanted to shelter their new civilization with a false sky barrier in the first place. And it also begs the question of where Khaenri'ah fits into this, because it's not one of the original 7 regions under the control of Celestia. But lucky for us, we can now attempt to answer these questions thanks to Arlecchino. But let's start with motivations, because that seems pretty easy. Why exactly was the Primordial One intent on conquering and repopulating Teyvat with humans? To answer this question, we gotta go to the library. I think most of us suspected that the book Perinheri had something to do with Arlecchino's lineage and the founding of Khaenri'ah before she released. But now, thanks to her 5th character story, we have confirmation, because in that story, Piero straight up tells her that she can find answers to her questions about her dreams of the Crimson Moon and her strange bloodfire powers in that book. In other words, Perinheri tells the story of the Crimson Moon Dynasty, the very first dynasty of Khaenri'ah from which Arlecchino is descended. And you know the really cool thing? Perinheri actually has some themes in common with the fairy tale Per the Penguin. And yeah, that's the same Per as the one that Freminet has. Now, Per's story is found in a book called Tales of a Snow-Winged Goose, which is a play on Mother Goose. Conveniently, Mother Goose has a pantomime variant called Harlequinade, which features, you guessed it, Harlequin, aka the Commedia dell'arte's Arlecchino. Now, this could be a coincidence, but I'm pretty confident that the first story in this book, which is about Princess Marcotte, is actually about Arlecchino's childhood friend, Clairvy. In fact, I made a whole video about it, and it was kind of rushed because I wanted to get it out before the patch drop, but the general idea ended up being pretty on point. She's a little girl with long pink hair who was trapped in a tower and was never allowed to grow up, mostly because she died. There are more parallels, but it's not really relevant for right now. So because the first story was about someone Penguin related to Arlecchino, it was reasonable to assume that the other stories might be too. This was the logic of my lore buddy Katsu, who started looking into the parallels between Arlecchino and Per the Penguin, only to decide that this story was actually about Arlecchino herself. In other words, Arlecchino is Per, which is really funny in hindsight because her real name is Peruer, and Claire V calls her Peri. So now we have a Peruer, a Peri, a Per, and a Perinheri. And that can't be a coincidence, that's too many pairs. And neither can the fact that Arlecchino is wearing a tuxedo, like a penguin. I mean, just look at baby Arlecchino holding this little fish. That, my friend, is a penguin in a human form. So okay, I can hear your skepticism through the screen. Surely you don't think that the only thing I have to connect Per the Penguin to Perinheri and Arlecchino are their names, right? Of course not. I haven't even explained why these stories explain the reason why the primordial one came to Teyvat yet, and that's actually what we're here for. But I'm gonna do that now. So, Perinheri is also called Hliobrante Innamorato, and it's a reference to a 1493 book called Orlando Innamorato, and its sequel, Orlando Furioso. Now, while Volume 1 of Perinheri doesn't really reference the events of its inspiration at all, Volume 2 does. Volume 2 actually follows Perinheri, his best friend Hliobrant, and the mysterious Angelica, who is named after an angel, and you'll understand why that's relevant later, as Hliobrant desperately vies for her attention, just like in Orlando Innamorato. Now, elsewhere in Fontaine, you can fight the local legend fairy knight twins named Angelica and Medoro. Now, this is a reference to Orlando Furioso because Medoro is the man that Angelica ultimately marries in the end. Defeating this local legend earns you the achievement Like Tears in the Rain, which is a reference to the Tears in the Rain monologue from the 1982 version of Blade Runner. And if you go back and look at the story of Per the Penguin, you can find the lines from the red giants to white dwarfs, from the shoulder of Orion to the glimmering Tannhauser Gate, which is also a reference to the Tears in the Rain monologue from the 1982 version of Blade Runner. Seriously though, this cannot be a coincidence. This is way too specific. So assuming it's not a coincidence, because it's definitely not, then what do these stories actually have in common beyond Blade Runner? Well, Per the Penguin tells a story of penguins that used to fly freely throughout the galaxy, but due to an interstellar catastrophe, some penguins split from their flock and landed in the southern oceans of Teyvat. Perinheri, on the other hand, contains a story that says there were once sea people who believed that the gods came from the sea. And then later in the book, we learn that there are no oceans or seas in Khaenri'ah, and that those terms were used as metaphors for outer space, which means that there were once people and gods who came to Teyvat from outer space, just like in Per the Penguin. The book then goes on to talk about accepting extraterrestrials who could transcend the gods. Now, these are descenders like the Traveler, as well as children coming from destroyed worlds, which ironically is also just like the Traveler because the twins are from another world that was destroyed. They were from another subjugated civilization. So in a nutshell, both these stories are talking about aliens coming to Teyvat due to a world being destroyed by an interstellar catastrophe. The main takeaway here is that the themes of these books, if true, would add some important context to the Primordial One's history and goals. Enjo and the rest of the Abyss Order were looking for evidence that Celestia, the Primordial One included, were life forms not native to Teyvat, so it's reasonable to believe they may have come from a world destroyed by an interstellar catastrophe somewhere in the galaxy, then tried to rebuild human civilization inside some sort of safety zone in Teyvat, hidden from their pursuers. There are other possibilities here, yes, but my logic is actually based on the references found in Perinheri and Per the Penguin, namely Blade Runner, because that reference was definitely chosen for a reason. The world of Blade Runner is one where humans are beginning to colonize other planets and moons, but the environment of these off-world colonies appear to be very hostile since millions of genetically engineered human clones called replicants are trained as interstellar soldiers in order to fight back against a force we never learn more about. They're basically fighting an interstellar war, so real humans don't have to. And funnily enough, both Perinheri and Per the Penguin have mention of birds splitting into two new types of birds. Perinheri says that birds had not yet split into domestic and wild kindreds, while Per the Penguin says that seagulls split into two races of birds, seagulls who would continue to fly and auks that would never fly again. Now, according to Perinheri, this event happened after the fall of the Crimson Moon Dynasty, so if we assume that the birds are metaphors for humans, then this suggests that humans split into two races that were very similar to each other as the dynasty fell. I think this split is represented by the Khaenri'ahns, who are the penguins or wild birds, and the Teyvatians, who are auks or domesticated birds. I will justify this split later in the theory. This also makes penguins kinda like the humans of Blade Runner, while the auks are like the replicants, because some auks are completely indistinguishable from the penguins, just like how replicants are nearly indistinguishable from regular humans. humans. But the weird coincidences don't stop there. While it's up for a little debate, many believe that this infamous Tannhauser Gate from the Tears in the Rain monologue in Blade Runner is a reference to Richard Wagner's opera Tannhauser, which was about a poet who became entranced with the goddess Venus. And the fact that this is an opera by Wagner is suspicious because Genshin takes heavy inspiration from his other opera, The Ring Cycle, which we're not really going to dive too deep into because I'm going to get very distracted. And I don't know if this was intentional on Hoyo's part, but back in 2020, there was this weird situation where news outlets misunderstood a paper that scientists wrote about signs of life on the planet Venus. From what I can understand, scientists had discovered a biosignature of the chemical phosphine in the clouds of Venus, and phosphine is something produced by penguins. So news outlets kind of thought that the scientists were saying that penguins lived on Venus. So penguins in space, like Per the Penguin. And Venus is suspicious here because it's the morning and evening star that's associated with both the twins and the light bringer Lucifer, to whom the demon Paimon is most loyal. And funnily enough, we know that the Traveler twins came from some destroyed world and that they were the last descendants of a subjugated civilization, which sounds like an interstellar war to me. According to the Sword of Dissension, at some time in the past, humankind was actually trying to preserve a doomed world. It suggested that they faced a, quote, star-devouring darkness, and the Wings of Dissension echo this idea with the lines, but when you face a force enough to destroy one or even two worlds, or when you face a boundless darkness or an all-consuming radiance, and then it just kind of cuts off there. But this warning was given 1 world ago, and Perinheri talks about traversing the fires of 2 worlds. Now, I actually think this line of Perinheri is a little bit less literal, but I do like the repeating patterns here. And to add to this, the twins started out the game with angel wings, which kind of assists the Arlecchino angel agenda that this video is kind of working towards. We're gonna get there eventually, I promise. But let's not get any more distracted than we already are. The point of this section is that Arlecchino is Peruer, who is likely Per the Penguin, and the story of Per the Penguin, it has the same themes as Perinheri. I've tried to figure out what the name Perinheri means for a long time to try and make this work a little bit better, but I've had no real definite answer. But if I split the name in half, it becomes Perinheri, like pair, inherit. And that gave me an idea. Because see, Per the Penguin was a little bit different from the other penguins because he didn't arrive into that like the others. He was born there. He was an heir to the penguin lineage. Per is an heir. Perinheri. This is by no means a proper translation, but I think the idea that Arlecchino is a descendant of Perinheri makes sense. But for that to be true, Perinheri has to be from the Crimson Moon's bloodline, otherwise Arlecchino isn't inheriting her Bale Moon blood from anywhere. And believe it or not, this blood inheritance can tell us a lot about the people of Khaenri'ah, and obviously Arlecchino. Okay, stick with me because this is about to get a little bit messy. Arlecchino was designed to represent a vampire. No, I'm serious, like just look at her. Or maybe look at her kit. Blood debt directive, blood debt due. She can make things out of her blood. She can manipulate people's minds when they drink her blood. Okay, she's more like burning away their memories, but like thematically, this is a thing that vampires do. She also has what seems to be raw meat covered in a sauce that looks like blood as her signature dish. Even her Mask of the Red Death state fits here because it's a story about how a lot of rich people locked themselves away in a mansion while the rest of the city suffered from the plague until the plague came for them in a human-esque form, the Red Death. Now, plagues like the one described here were usually attributed to supernatural causes like vampires. The idea was that the bodies of the deceased would reanimate at night and consume the blood of the living, and some believed that those vampires could infect the living with their vampirism, thus turning people into vampires themselves, the undead victims of the plague, hence Mask of the Red Death. And if we follow this train of thought and look at different types of vampires, like the Romanian or Slavic vampires, we can see them being conflated with witches, which is fitting given that Senora is the Crimson Witch of Flames. Now, this might seem like a leap, I know, but in my previous speculative analysis, I compared Arlecchino and La Senora because of their similarities in the gradient markings on their arms, links with cleansing fire, potential butterfly motifs, and links with death and rebirth. That comparison held up really well, so I won't bother rehashing it here. You can just watch that video if you want the full story, because there's also more cool stuff in there. But there's a couple things I want to add. So prior to the Cataclysm, Senora was studying pyromagic as an apprentice at the Sumeru Academia and had, according to the Crimson Witch of Flame set, stumbled upon a long-forgotten art that destroyed her mortal body and caused her to mutate into the Crimson Witch of Flames during the Cataclysm. And if you look closer at both Senora and Arlecchino's boss forms, you're gonna notice more similarities than I mentioned in my previous videos. Namely, the similarities between the feathered flame wings, the shape of the bones that their wings are made of, the markings on both their chests and back, and we know that both Arlecchino and Senora have liquid fire pumping through their veins, and both will be consumed by that fire eventually. Arlecchino manages to keep her blood fire under control by suppressing her emotions emotions, since the spread of her quote-unquote blessing is tied to her emotional state, but Signora lacks that ability and relies on a cryo-delusion instead. That's way too many similarities between these two to be a coincidence, and I've already left a lot of other similarities out, so I suspect that the long-forgotten art that Signora used may have been the same one used by the Crimson Moon Dynasty in order to obtain the Crimson Moon's blessing, which means that the witch is a lesser variant of the vampire, which is totally in line with real-world mythology. As for this long-forgotten art, well, we might actually know what it entails. Spoilers! Blood is involved. So the dynasty of the Crimson Moon appears to have worshipped the red moon that hung in the sky over Khaenri'ah, an entity that they labeled as, quote, long dead, and still believed that it would somehow bring them salvation. It appears as though one of their rituals involved the drinking of wine as a pledge between them and the Crimson Moon at the end of their dynasty's reign. Now, on the surface, this seems a bit benign, but as I pointed out in my Paimon is actually emergency food video, wine is often conflated with blood, and not just in Genshin either, although we're gonna get to that. Lots of religions consume wine as a stand-in for the blood of a deity that they're worshipping, like the Eucharist rite. Doing so is supposed to allow the imbiber to take on the power, knowledge, or blessings of the god the substitute blood belongs to. Now, I think this is what's happening with the Crimson Moon Dynasty. The Crimson Moon semblance speaks of drinking wine as a pledge to the Crimson Moon, and soon after it likens the moon to the color of blood itself. Now, I think it's likely that the mention of drinking wine as a pledge to the Crimson Moon served as a starting point for how the people got the blessing of the Crimson Moon in the first place, this Bale Moon blood fire. And this may sound like a leap of logic to some of you, but I promise it's not without precedence. We already have instances of people and animals consuming the blood and flesh of dead gods as a means to alter their body in-game. I made a whole video about it, but our best and simplest example, as always, is Jacob Ingold. Now, Jacob was a pretty normal kid who fell terminally ill, and in order to save him, his friend, René de Petrichor, infused him with the power of the abyss that he had been studying. Doing so altered Jacob's body a bit, but it wasn't until he began to consume the blood of the fell dragon Elenus that he obtained the power to transform into an abyssling, something we know that the people of the Eclipse Dynasty were able to do since, you know, the whole Abyss Order thing, and by extension we could assume that the people of the Crimson Moon could also get a similar effect. Now, consecrated beasts are another example of god blood causing mutations, as the beasts were originally normal animals that ate the flesh of dead gods and then mutated. Now, there's no abyssal interference in this case of the consecrated beasts, but there is a reason why I mentioned it when it came to Jacob, and that's because the Crimson Moon's semblance says that the darkness within the bottom of the abyss is also found inside the Crimson Moon. Arlecchino's boss description goes on to claim that her ancestors once drank poison as their dynasty fell. Now, I'm assuming this poison is the wine mentioned in the Crimson Moon semblance because wine is a stand-in for blood, and the blood is a foundation of Arlecchino's inherited powers, and what's inside the moon seems to be abyssal powers, which are toxic. And lucky for us, there's a precedent for lumping wine and abyss juice together, and it comes from the book A Drunkard's Tale. In this book, a wolf speaks to a Seelie and tells her, "What you call wine, we call the abyss." And then he also calls it a poison. So I guess what I'm suggesting is that the people of the Crimson Moon Dynasty drank a substance that was probably toxic or poisonous to them, like it was wine at the fall of their dynasty, and this likely gave them powers in the process, similar to Jacob and the consecrated beasts. And I'm also suggesting that this wine-like poisonous substance was the blood of the Crimson Moon, or at the very least, a type of consecrated wine that would have made it very like the blood of the Crimson Moon, thus giving it the same kind of properties. But what's curious about these lines in A Drunkard's Tale is that it kind of implies that Seelies are quite compatible with the Abyss, and that kind of checks out. Because, like, take a look at Nabu Malikata, one of the only other confirmed Seelies that we've met. Her most infamous act was teaching Deshret about forbidden knowledge, which is what is found in the depths of the Abyss. And her child, the Jinni Lilupar, seems to have used abyssal power to sink the entirety of the city of Gurabad. Yes, that's a pretty small sample size of 3, but given how Seelies are connected to moons and at least one of the moons has abyss juice in it, I think the idea has some merit. But okay, there's probably one weird thing about this whole Crimson Moon blessing making vampires that probably doesn't make any sense. If the moons were angels, why would their blessings make these demonic creatures? And then I realized they're not actually demonic. Not really. I mean, the difference between angels and demons is debatable in the first place. But even if you look at the abysslings, like the lectors and the heralds and everything, they have a lot in common with angels, even though they also seem kinda demonic. Some of them have the ring halos at the back of their head, others speak of lines from the Book of Revelations, like the end is nigh and that kind of stuff. Incidentally, the Book of Revelations also has a big crimson moon in it. That's one of the omens of the end times. And heralds, which is one of the types of abysslings, is actually a label for a type of angel. So this isn't outside of the realm of possibility. All it means is that an angel plus a human makes an angel human, which means that Arlecchino is an angel human, which makes her true nature kind of more similar to that of an abyssling, but probably like just a different variant thereof. Back on the Arlecchino is an angel agenda. In her boss form, Arlecchino has a bunch of these little weird limbless sprites that float around kinda uselessly. There's no lore about them, no text descriptions, no dialogue, no nothing. They're just kinda there. But as many have pointed out, these little sprites have some visual similarities with the Pari, at least half of the time. And the Pari are a race of fairies that were birthed from the Simurgh, a being made of Nabu Malikata's power before she passed. And Nabu Malikata was a Seelie. That makes the Pari the grandchildren of a Seelie. The way I see it, Arlecchino's incomplete Pari are a signifier of her connection to the Seelies who are angels, because she's making little baby angel grandchildren thing. And the neat thing here is that the Simurgh was created to be, quote, the guardian of the border between new birth and death, which to me sounds like an entity that bridges the gap between two worlds of life and death. So when Arlecchino's story talks about burning with the fire of two worlds, I really think that this might be what they mean, the world of the living and the world of the dead. And what a beautiful coincidence it is that the Persian Simurgh is a bird of fire. And this is where the idea of the flames in her blood manipulating memories comes into play. See, in Genshin, memories are akin to life and death. Think about how the fragments of Apep died when they were reabsorbed into her, or how Aranaga says that death is a one-time loss of memory during Aranyaka, or how Arlecchino says that losing a portion of your memories will alter your sense of self in the context of wiping her children's memory as a sort of death and rebirth process. Memories are themselves representative of life, and Arlecchino has the ability to, quote, hit the reset button on those memories by extracting special flames from her blood, thus giving those who consume them a brand new life. That's actually why she has the constellation of Ignis Purgatorius, because purgatory is actually a state that exists between life and death. It's what your soul goes through to process yourself for rebirth, or the afterlife, depending on what religion you're looking at. In other words, all of your past memories and sins or whatever are being cleansed, burned away into nothing so you can move on. And this unironically makes her very much like the Simurgh, the guardian of the border between new birth and death, purgatory. And that plays into Perinheri again, because he was told in the book that you have traversed the fire of two worlds within the hearth, the flames, and here you are reborn. Which actually, now that I think about it, kind of sounds like he might have had his memory wiped, which might be why this is one of his earliest memories. And as the bloody icing on this cake, Arlecchino normally floats with only one wing, but her boss form has 6 featherless bone wings. An angel with 6 wings is usually called a seraph, and seraphs are angels typically associated with fire. In Judaism, they're said to be constantly burning in a process of self-nullification, which, given Arlecchino's X-shaped eyes, yeah, kind of checks out. Now, do seraphs drink blood? No, not that I know of, but I do know of a type of angel that does drink blood, and they just so happen to be the product of angels and humans mingling together. That's right, angel vampires are real, and they are called Nephilim. So according to the Book of Enoch, the original generations of humans were being monitored by a group of angels known as the Watchers. The leader of these Watchers, Semyaza, proposed that the angels go down to Earth and, procreate with the humans. The resulting children were these angel-human hybrids known as the Nephilim. The Watchers proceeded to then teach their spouses and children everything they knew: metallurgy, cosmetics, herbology, and even alchemy. And actually, this kind of sounds like what the Goetic demons do, and also what the Seelies did. What a coincidence. Now, the Nephilim are described as horrifying giants in some texts, and kinda normal people in others, but regardless of description, they are accused of committing a sin so atrocious that the archangels Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel beg God to destroy them with a flood. One of these sins is the drinking of blood. This story is actually Enoch's justification for the Genesis flood found in the story of Noah's Ark, which is referenced quite often in Genshin's Genesis tale before Sun and Moon. So there you have it. Half human, half angel, and they drink blood. It kinda sounds like Arlecchino in the Crimson Moon Dynasty, doesn't it? But if Genshin is actually pulling from the Book of Enoch, then it changes a few things contextually about our Tevat Genesis tale. So let me attempt to fill in the blanks. Seelies are Genshin's angels, but since they were in charge of teaching humans, they are essentially the Watchers, which is interesting because Seelies are supposed to be cursed to never fall in love or else they lose their forms. It kind of sounds like a failsafe put in place for Enochian reasons. But this would also imply that Seelies were known for mingling with humans in an undesirable way, thereby creating a race of Nephilim. And I don't think that's actually what happened. Remember that in the beginning, Teyvat belonged to the elemental dragons, and the elements are kinda toxic to humans in high doses without a vision. What this implies is that the Primordial One probably tried to create a human civilization on an inhospitable planet, maybe because they had no other options. But if the planet was hostile to regular humans, then humans would need to, adapt, perhaps through some sort of genetic engineering. And that's why I think the Primordial One actually intentionally mixed the genetics of Seelies with humans to create the Nephilim, an attempt to create a new form of human that was actually compatible with this new world. So the people of the original unified civilization are the Nephilim, who later became the people of Khaenri'ah, which sounds great, except there's one small problem with this idea. If humans were mixed with Seelies in order to become compatible with this new world, then Seelies must be native to Teyvat, which means they must actually be dragons because dragons are the native species on this planet, which is more likely than you'd think. The designs of Seelies and dragons have both been based on aquatic life, especially sea slugs, and Nabu Malikata theoretically had horns, same as the Seelies, and that's something that the dragons also have in common. And wait, hold on, pause for a second. It is way out of the scope of this video to try and prove that Seelies are dragons without a shadow of a doubt. So I'm not going to do that, but I am going to point out a few things that make the idea very compelling. And that idea is tied to fate itself. So it's pretty common to see people theorize about the Moon Sisters being the three fates of Greek mythology, or the Norns of Norse mythology, of which there are also three. I won't get too much into it, but for me it basically boils down to the Triquetra having lunar and triple goddess associations while also being used in Celtic mythology as a symbol of the Morrigan, the triple goddess of war and fate. So I'm going to proceed with this association between the triple goddesses, moons, and the three fates because I found something rather interesting in the Crimson Moon's semblance. In the last paragraph, there's a line that reads, "Fate, fate, oh terrifying and pale fate, why must you abase yourself and submit to such a tyrannical usurper? If the Bale Moon's remnants have already sealed your doom, what meaning could be found in the blood vengeance of bygone days?" So pale fate to me kinda sounds like a pale moon, don't you think? And if it is, then this passage might suggest that one of the Moon Sisters may have submitted herself to the usurper, to the Primordial One. And this is very interesting because we know that the Moon Sisters were governing Teyvat over 6,000 years ago, which is long before Morax even arrived in Teyvat, and he's the oldest entity that we have an age for. But if they were around before Morax, then they may have been around during the era of dragons. And one look at our only playable dragon sovereign, Neuvillette, and you'll see something rather interesting. There's a Triquetra built right into his kit. That's the symbol of the triple goddess, and obviously a symbol of the moon as well. If the moons aren't associated with dragons, then why does he have this? Okay, so imagine that it's over 6,000 years ago, and the sisters are just chilling in the sky, doing their thing with their little Seelies chilling along with them, and then suddenly an Outlander shows up. This Outlander gets permission to marry a Seelie, and 30 days later, a catastrophe hits. 2 moons die, and some of the Seelies fade away, but not all of them. This is one of the Moon Sister legends. Now, I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say that the Primordial One would be that Outlander, and if they were permitted to marry a Seelie, then I'm looking at that as basically code for, I'm gonna take these genes and use them in my human genome project. And once they had what they were looking for, which was Seelie genes, they began to take the world by force. Perhaps their power was so great that even the moons couldn't fight back. Perhaps one of them was even killed by the Primordial One, and the remaining 2 had split opinions on what to do next. One may have wanted to surrender and keep damages to a minimum, while the other may have wanted to resist and fought her sister over it. There is a tale about the sisters turning on and killing each other. So, doesn't that imply some sort of betrayal? So we assume 2 moons are defeated and the remaining one surrenders to the Primordial One. This must be his pale fate. The Seelies who answered to the dead moons likely faded away with them, while the remaining Seelies who followed the traitorous moon survived, and they became the Watchers who took care of the fledgling humans. Nabu Malikata would have been among these Watchers. And around this same time, the Solar Chariot would have fallen to Earth. Now, this may have belonged to the Dragon King Nibelung, since a pep strongly implies that the era in which the moons fell is the same as the one in which Nibelung fought the primordial one. You with me so far? Great, because we're almost done. So this new era is the era of the unified civilization, which is populated by the Nephilim. And I think everything was going pretty smoothly here for a while until the invaders from beyond the sky broke through the firmament and nearly destroyed everything. This would have been a Genesis flood-like event that should have wiped out all the Nephilim. Except it didn't. Even in the Book of Enoch, some of the Nephilim are suggested to have survived. Now, I think most of the survivors went underground and discovered a realm outside of Celestia's grasp, and that would later become Khaenri'ah. This would be the establishment of the Crimson Moon Dynasty. Now, at this point, I think there were little to no survivors on the surface, and the primordial one had to restart their repopulation efforts from scratch. Remember that story about the penguins and the ox? The wild and the domesticated birds splitting off? This is where I think the split should have occurred, right at the fall of the Crimson Moon Dynasty. Perhaps what the Crimson Moon astrologers saw was actually related to this split in humanity, and the revelations they had were so devastating that the Nephilim swore off the worship of gods entirely, leading to the establishment of the Eclipse Dynasty, a nation with no gods. Now, what's even more interesting about this Nephilim idea is that the Dragon King's name, Nibelung, comes from the root word Nephil, meaning fog, mist, or cloud, and in the ring cycle, an opera Genshin takes heavy inspiration from, the race of Nibelung are dwarves which live underground, kinda like the Khaenri'ahns. So it would be so easy to imagine Hoyoverse pulling a little wordplay here on Nephilim and Niflheim, implying that these humans in particular are children of two worlds, the draconic and the human, especially since two dragons in the game have the names of dwarves, Dvalin and Durin. And this might explain why Ryandaughters' research into primordial humans involved both a human, which is Albedo, and a couple of dragons, Durin and Elenus. It's not like she wants to make the first human from days long past, it's that she's trying to artificially blend the primordial and the human together, exactly what the primordial one did in the beginning. She's trying to make new Nephilim. But you know what's kind of interesting about the dragons? Dragons don't die, not really. They kind of just get dispersed until they can reincarnate into a new body, but they can often take their memories with them, meaning it's not really a true death as we understand it. And so far, dragon blood has been an interesting feature, coming up with Dvalin in his boss fight, then Durin and Elenus, and even Nuvalet, who tells us that Vishops, a type of dragon, drinks the blood of their deceased. You know, kind of like how the people of the Crimson Moon drank the blood of their dead god. And as a final interesting observation, if you did the Remuria questline, you'll have met Sibylla, a golden Seelie that agreed to become the hive mind of every person in Remuria, which turned her red as she assumed the name Phobos, which is the name of one of Mars's moons. A red moon, a collective consciousness that is also a red moon. Now, don't you think it's weird that humans can fuse with a Seelie like this? It would only make sense if they're similar life forms, even if that similarity is pretty small. And so far, this whole mind meldy thing, or like lots of little things making one big thing, or one big thing splitting into lots of little things, has been a natural trait that's fairly exclusive to dragons, although it is found in Seelies. Like, think about a pep fracturing and absorbing her fungi fragments, or how Nuvalet's primordial sea can blend minds together. And then think about how the fragments of the dragon Elenus turned into the Melazines, and how similar that is to the daughter of a Seelie, the Simurgh, which had its fragments turn into the Pari. And this isn't a one-off either. Records of Jueyun Volume 4 says that the Seelies withered away, leaving fragments of their former selves scattered in the mountains and ruins. Which means the Seelies we find might be fragments of a larger Seelie, and not just individual Seelies. Also, Seelies lead us to treasure, and what do dragons like to hoard? Treasure. That means these Seelies are like bringing us to their tiny little treasure hoards. What I actually want you guys to take away from this is that Arlecchino is a Nephilim, at least as far as I'm concerned, and that makes her a descendant of the original unified civilization, and she can take the form and use the powers of a seraph thanks to the blessing of the Crimson Moon's blood, and by extension, the rest of the Khaenri'ahn noble bloodlines must also belong to the Nephilim, and that's why things like the Curse of the Wilderness affect them differently from the other people of Tevat. Actually, you know what? This vampire angel Nephilim stuff might actually explain why Kaya and Dainsleif both enjoy their booze so much. Like, alcohol is a stand-in for blood. This is actually my third attempt at this theory, and honestly, it has so much stuff in it still that I'm not even sure I conveyed everything all that well. But I hope you at least got something cool out of it. And these lovely people scrolling by right now are my lore enablers. They enable my bad lore habits, so say thank you because they make these videos possible. But I guess I gotta buy some time for them to scroll on by now, huh? I guess you want some funny cut content that didn't really fit anywhere in this draft? because I have some. Might help explain some penguin stuff. There's this absolutely bonkers book from 1908 called Penguin Island, and it's a satirical alternate history of France that starts on an island inhabited by ox, penguins, and nearly blind and deaf humans. Now, because the humans couldn't see that well, they thought that the ox were people, so they baptized them. And then God was like, hey, stop that, only humans can be baptized. So in order to kind of like fix this mistake, he decided to just turn all of these baptized birds into humans, and what we now know of as France became Penguinia. And of all the possible references for this book to contain, the story actually talks about how the world of Penguinia is in an endless cycle. Like maybe the eternal return that Genshin keeps talking about, or the root cycles we learned about during the Narcissenkreuz quest. And I don't know, I just kind of think that the whole idea of like penguins and humans ruling France as like a satirical alternate version of history is really freaking funny. Anyway, that is enough from me. I'm gonna stop talking before my editor decides to quit because these videos are too long. So thank you for watching, gotta go, see you later, bye!